It's 6 a.m. in a sleek, modern city apartment. Naomi Evans wakes to the familiar hum of her phone buzzing, a dozen new emails arriving in her inbox. It's a sound she's grown accustomed to over the years, one that reminds her that no matter how much she accomplishes, there's always more to do. She doesn't reach for the phone. Not yet. Instead, she takes a deep breath, pulls back the blinds to let in the soft morning light, and sits on the edge of her bed. Another day, another set of challenges. Her routine is precise, almost mechanical, but Naomi knows it's necessary. She glances at the clock. 6:15 a.m. The quiet moments are fleeting. Soon the whirlwind of her life will begin. Please subscribe now for more powerful stories like this. Your support means the world to me. Naomi's journey wasn't paved with easy wins. There were no handouts or shortcuts. Only relentless effort in an industry where few looked like her. Raised by a single mother in a modest neighborhood, Naomi quickly learned the weight of persistence. Her mother, an elementary school teacher, worked long hours to make sure Naomi had every opportunity she could. But there were costs, moments Naomi would never get back, like childhood playdates and sleepovers. Instead, Naomi found herself at the kitchen table, cramming for exams or working late into the night to help make ends meet. Despite the sacrifices, Naomi's ambition burned fiercely. From a young age, she'd known she wanted more than just a steady job. She wanted to break barriers. But the airline industry she dreamed of entering was dominated by men. White men. Men who didn't look like her, didn't share her story. Yet they couldn't stop her. Naomi's drive wasn't fueled by a desire to prove anyone wrong. It was about building a future where women and people of color could walk into any room and know their worth was already established. The journey wasn't smooth, and there were moments when exhaustion almost took its toll. College was a blur of classes, part-time jobs, and sleepless nights. Naomi earned her degree in business administration with a focus on operations. But the weight of it all was real. Her mind wandered back to those nights spent slumped over textbooks, wondering if it was all worth it. But her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Success isn't about luck, Naomi. It's about perseverance. Her first job at a regional airline wasn't glamorous. As an intern, she ran errands, fetched coffee, and answered calls. But Naomi didn't see it as demeaning. She saw it as a foothold. After all, every major player in the industry had started somewhere, right? Late nights in the office became her norm as she learned the ropes of flight schedules, logistics, and operational inefficiencies. It wasn't glamorous, but Naomi quickly earned a reputation as meticulous, reliable, and, most importantly, innovative. It didn't take long for Naomi to climb the ranks. With every promotion, she carved out a place for herself in an industry that rarely embraced women, let alone black women. Eventually, she became the head of operations at one of the nation's largest airlines. But even at the top, the climb was far from over. Naomi had learned that her achievements often weren't enough to silence the microaggressions, the racial bias, the constant weight of having to prove herself. The glass ceiling was always there, just above her reach, reminding her that no matter how high she rose, her presence would always feel like an anomaly. Through it all, Naomi made sacrifices. She missed family reunions, skipped birthdays, and sometimes her work came at the expense of her relationships. But she never lost sight of the bigger picture, the legacy she was determined to build, a legacy of equality, a legacy of change. As the sun barely rises, Naomi prepares her family's breakfast, scrambled eggs, whole grain toast, and fresh fruit. Maya, her daughter, rushes into the kitchen, excited for school. Naomi smiles, placing the plate in front of her, kissing her daughter's cheek. Despite being one of the top executives in the airline industry, Naomi has never let go of the importance of being present for her family, especially for Maya. Marcus, her husband, enters the kitchen next. Quiet, calm, and steady, Marcus has been her anchor through the years. He knows the toll Naomi's career takes on her, but he understands her need to push forward. They exchange a few words about their day ahead, and as Naomi glances at the clock, 7:15 a.m., she knows she has just enough time to get ready for work. She rushes through her morning routine, showering, dressing, packing her briefcase. The wardrobe she's carefully curated is filled with tailored suits that speak authority. But it's the small details that give her confidence. Her favorite watch, a necklace with her daughter's birthstone. It's these rituals that ground her amidst the chaos. But balance, Naomi knows, is a myth. Family time is a luxury she can rarely afford. The late-night phone calls, the constant travel, the never-ending meetings, it's all part of the job. And Naomi has learned to make the most of her time at home, always present when she's there, but often thinking ahead to her next big move in the airline industry. As she steps into the office, Naomi's eyes fall on the reports stacked on her desk. She takes a sip of coffee as she scans the latest airline performance analytics. Every decision she makes affects thousands of lives, from the flight crews to the passengers. Today, she's reviewing a strategy to streamline flight operations. Efficiency, she knows, is everything. Her assistant, Jennifer, greets her with a stack of documents. Naomi glances at the top file, a progress report on recent customer satisfaction initiatives. Naomi's eyes narrow as she notices the inconsistencies. The airline's service is falling short, and Naomi knows she'll need to address it head-on. It's going to be a long day. Her first meeting is with the senior management team. Naomi leads the conversation with authority, but it's the way she listens that sets her apart. She values every voice in the room, ensuring that all perspectives are heard. Today, the discussion is about the airline's upcoming fleet expansion, a massive undertaking that will require meticulous coordination and strategy. But even as the meeting presses on, Naomi's thoughts wander. She's scheduled for a flight later today, and she's looking forward to some downtime. It's rare for her to be on a flight without work piling up, but today she plans to use the time to rest before an important board meeting. Naomi's always loved flying, the brief escape, the space to think. At 1 p.m., Naomi's assistant tells her it's time to head to the airport. She grabs her briefcase, checks her phone for any last-minute updates, and walks out the door. The airport routine is second nature. Check-in, security, boarding, it's all part of the rhythm she's mastered over the years. But something feels different today. Today, the flight is a routine business trip. No special arrangements, no upgrades. Naomi's a frequent flyer, but this time, she's looking forward to the solitude, the quiet. She arrives at the gate, scans her boarding pass, and finds her seat in the waiting area. The terminal hums with activity, but Naomi remains calm, focused. But when she approaches the gate agent to inquire about an upgrade, she's met with an unexpected response, an empty smile and a flat refusal. Naomi's mind races for a moment. She calmly asks again, explaining her role within the company, but the agent doesn't budge. The routine Naomi had carefully constructed is shattered. The quiet flight she'd hoped for is now overshadowed by the feeling of frustration, of a battle she didn't expect to fight today. Little does she know, this small incident will set off a chain of events that will test everything she's worked for: her leadership, her patience, and her ability to stay composed in the face of an unexpected confrontation. Naomi entered the plane, her mind already racing ahead to the hectic day awaiting her once she landed. But today felt different. Normally, she thrived on the fast pace of travel, checking schedules, meeting deadlines, solving problems on the fly. But this time, she wasn't the one in charge. She wasn't the executive with the answers, the one making decisions for thousands of passengers. Today, she was just another traveler. She walked briskly down the narrow aisle, nodding to familiar faces, exchanging pleasantries with the flight crew. Naomi was used to being recognized, but today, She was determined to blend in. For once, she just wanted to be a passenger, someone who wasn't constantly under the microscope. As the head of operations for one of the world's largest airlines, her name often opened doors. But today, she wanted the anonymity of a simple, quiet flight. The young flight attendant greeted her with a warm, "Welcome aboard," her voice bright and welcoming. Naomi smiled back politely, but there was something about the flight attendant's gaze, too curious, too eager, that raised a small, unnoticed flag. Naomi had been on enough flights to recognize when someone was trying a bit too hard to be friendly, but she brushed it off, attributing it to the airline's customer service focus. "Thank you," Naomi said, settling into her seat. She went through her usual routine, adjusting the seat, opening her laptop to catch up on messages, checking in with her team. Despite the rare opportunity to disconnect, Naomi couldn't help herself. Her life demanded constant vigilance. Work was never far behind, even on a flight. As the plane taxied down the runway, the attendant passed by again. This time, she made small talk. "How's your day going? Any fun plans when you get to your destination?" Naomi smiled, offering polite but curt responses. The conversation felt a little too insistent, but Naomi didn't think much of it. She'd experienced stranger interactions on flights. The attendant continued on, but something lingered in the air, an odd, unsettled feeling that Naomi couldn't quite place. It wasn't until the flight attendant made her way to the front to announce boarding instructions for first class that Naomi's attention was fully drawn. The attendant called out the flight details and amenities, but Naomi's mind was elsewhere. She was mentally checking her calendar for the meetings ahead. That's when she saw the attendant linger near her seat, casting a look that seemed almost hesitant. Naomi raised an eyebrow and leaned slightly forward. "Excuse me," she said calmly. "I believe there was an issue with my seating. I was expecting an upgrade to first class." The attendant's face faltered for a split second before she masked it with a polite smile. "I'm afraid that's not possible, ma'am," she said. "Company policy, only premium members can upgrade at this time. We have no available space." Naomi froze, her heart rate picking up a notch. She had been flying this airline for years, had spent countless hours working with their teams, and had always been upgraded on flights like this. Something wasn't adding up. Her mind whirred as she processed the words. "I've flown this airline countless times," Naomi said, keeping her voice even, but there was a sharp edge beneath the calm exterior. "I've never had an issue with upgrades, especially on a business trip like this." The attendant's smile tightened, her eyes darting nervously around the cabin. "There are no available seats in first class, ma'am. I'm sorry." Naomi's pulse quickened, and frustration bubbled up. She knew this wasn't about policy, it was something else. She had worked hard to earn respect in an industry that constantly tried to diminish her, and now this subtle, insidious form of discrimination. The sense of being dismissed. Naomi's mind flashed back to the countless times she'd fought for a seat at the table, only to have someone undermine her authority because of her gender and race. She remembered the early days in the airline industry, when she was still an operations coordinator, working late while her male colleagues left early, making sure every detail was perfect while they overlooked her work. Every promotion had felt like an uphill battle. She had earned every inch of her success through sheer determination, but it had never been easy. She had been overlooked, undermined, and forced to work harder just to be considered equal to her peers. But this felt different. It wasn't just a mistake, it was deliberate. Naomi's mind raced as she made her decision. "I understand if there's been a mix-up," Naomi said, her voice steady but tinged with authority. "But I've had this flight arranged for weeks. I'm an executive with this company. You don't know who I am." The attendant paused, caught off guard, but only for a moment. "Are you sure?" she asked, clearly uncertain now, her eyes flicking nervously to Naomi's face. Naomi's voice was calm but firm as she replied, "Yes, I'm sure." The words hung in the air. Naomi's gaze didn't waver. The tension was palpable. A few heads turned, some passengers glancing over curiously at the growing exchange. Naomi felt their eyes on her, but it didn't matter. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every woman and every person of color who had ever been dismissed or overlooked. The attendant's nervousness grew. She shifted from foot to foot, unsure how to proceed. "I've already told you, ma'am." Naomi cut her off. "And I've already told you, I'm not going to let this slide." She stood up, her voice rising just enough to make the cabin take notice. "I'm not just any passenger. I'm not someone you can dismiss with a shrug and a company policy." For a moment, there was silence. Naomi could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the eyes of the passengers on her every move. Some were whispering to each other. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But Naomi didn't back down. She had spent years proving her worth, fighting for respect, and she wasn't going to let anyone undermine her now. The flight attendant, flustered, stepped back. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry, but there's really nothing I can do." Naomi looked at her squarely. "It's not about the seat," she said, her voice unwavering. "It's about respect. I'm a member of this airline's executive team. I don't expect special treatment, but I do expect to be treated with the same level of respect as any other passenger." The attendant faltered, unsure how to proceed. Naomi's words had cut through the air, leaving an undeniable silence in their wake. Naomi took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't just fighting for an upgrade. This was about something much larger. It was about standing her ground, not just for her own dignity, but for every person who had ever been made to feel less than. With a final glance at the attendant, Naomi made her way toward the front of the plane, her steps purposeful. The tension in the cabin was thick now, everyone watching, waiting. Naomi wasn't going to back down. Not this time. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about dignity. It was about respect. And Naomi wasn't going to let anyone forget it. Naomi stood in the aisle, her body rigid, her voice steady but filled with the weight of the moment as she addressed the young flight attendant. The attendant, already visibly sweating under the pressure, looked like she wanted to retreat, but Naomi wasn't about to let her. "I need to speak with your manager," Naomi demanded, her eyes locking with the attendant's, every word calculated, deliberate. The flight attendant hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as she fumbled for a response. Finally, she nodded quickly, retreating to speak with another crew member. Naomi could see the ripple effect in the cabin. Conversation slowed. Eyes began to linger. Naomi felt the gaze of every passenger in the vicinity, their attention shifting towards the confrontation. The air in the cabin grew heavier. Naomi's heartbeat quickened, but she refused to look away. This wasn't about the seat anymore. It was about respect, dignity, and the deep-rooted biases that had too often been overlooked. Minutes passed before the senior flight attendant arrived. Naomi had seen this type before. Tall, with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put Naomi on edge. This wasn't going to be another pointless exchange about policy or company guidelines. This was about principle. Naomi could feel the rising pressure in her chest, but she steadied herself. The senior attendant approached Naomi with a forced smile, her eyes scanning the tension in the cabin. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I understand there's been some confusion with your seating. How can I help?" Naomi didn't flinch. "I've already explained the situation," she said, her voice level but carrying an undeniable authority. "I was told there were no upgrades available, but I know that's not true. I'm entitled to an upgrade under your airline's policy. I've been a loyal customer for years, and I've never encountered this issue." The senior attendant's smile faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly masked it, trying to maintain control of the situation. "I'm sure there's been a mistake, ma'am," she said, voice too smooth to practice. "Let me double-check our system." Naomi felt the fire of frustration building inside her, but she pushed it down. This wasn't just a mix-up. It wasn't just a case of overbooked seats. This was deliberate, and Naomi knew it. "It's not a mistake," Naomi said, her voice crisp, sharper now. "I've already been told by your colleague that there's no available seat in first class. But I know that's not the case. I'm not just any passenger. I'm Naomi Evans, head of operations for this airline, and I expect to be treated with the same respect as any other executive flying on our planes." The senior attendant froze, her face draining of color as Naomi's words landed. A stunned silence swept through the cabin, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Naomi could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the collective realization among the passengers. They were witnessing something larger than a seating issue. It was a confrontation about respect, about recognition, and about fairness. The flight attendant's eyes darted around the cabin as she opened her mouth, trying to speak, but no words came out. She was visibly shaken. Naomi's composure was a stark contrast to the flustered attendant, whose defensive posture collapsed. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I didn't know." The apology was quick, rushed, but Naomi didn't let it go. "I'm not interested in your apology," Naomi responded coldly, her gaze unwavering. "I'm interested in why I was treated this way. Why was I singled out? And why did you not treat me with the same courtesy you would any other passenger?" The senior attendant opened her mouth again, but no words came. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Naomi stood there, composed, every inch of her presence demanding attention. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about systemic issues, about bias, and about the treatment of people like her, people who had fought to be seen and respected. "This isn't just about a seat," Naomi continued, her voice calm but with an edge. "This is about the larger issue, about respect, professionalism, and equality. If you think this is just a mistake, you're mistaken." The senior flight attendant looked around, clearly unsure of how to respond as the weight of Naomi's words began to settle in. The cabin was still, all eyes now focused on the two of them. Naomi wasn't just upset. She was resolute. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly in a space that was supposed to serve them. The senior attendant finally broke the silence, clearly rattled. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to escalate this," she said, her voice shaking. "Let me call the airline manager to get this sorted out." Naomi nodded, but the frustration inside her only grew. She had already made her point clear. She wasn't going to let this be swept under the rug with a quick fix. This was about accountability, about addressing the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to flourish unchecked. As Naomi waited, her thoughts drifted back to the earlier days of her career. The late nights spent proving herself, while male colleagues were rewarded with promotions she had earned. The subtle glances, the backhanded compliments, the quiet dismissals. She had been fighting this battle for years, had earned every step, every promotion, and now this small but crucial fight was the culmination of all the injustices she had faced. She thought of her mother, who had always encouraged her to push forward, to rise above, and to demand what was rightfully hers. Her mother had seen her struggles, the racism, the sexism, the daily fight to be recognized. Naomi had made it this far by refusing to be silenced. The airline manager arrived after what felt like an eternity. He was a middle-aged man, impeccably dressed, his expression unreadable. Naomi immediately recognized the sense of authority in him. He was used to being in control, but Naomi had no intention of letting him control this situation. He extended his hand, but Naomi didn't take it. Instead, she stared him down, her voice calm but unyielding. "The issue is simple. I've been denied an upgrade, despite being entitled to it. But this isn't just about an upgrade. It's about how I was treated. I'm a senior executive for this airline, and I expect to be treated with the same respect as any other executive. This isn't a mistake. It's a reflection of a deeper problem. The flight attendant's behavior wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate. The manager blinked, clearly taken aback. He opened his mouth to speak, but Naomi cut him off. I've worked in this industry for over 20 years, she continued, her words sharp, cutting through the tension in the room. I've spent my career fighting against biases, whether they're sexist, racist, or just plain ignorant. I know this company's policies inside and out. And I know this wasn't a mistake. You know it and I know it. The question is, what are you going to do about it? The manager shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught off guard, but said nothing. Naomi could feel the collective gaze of the passengers. They were watching, leaning forward, waiting for the next move. I'm not going to sit back and let this be brushed under the rug, Naomi said, her voice firm and resolute. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's faced discrimination, who's been treated like they're less than. It's time to face this problem head on or let it continue to fester. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Naomi's words rang out, a challenge not just to the airline, but to every person who had ever ignored these issues. The manager sighed, his shoulders slumping. I understand. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again. We'll look into it, and I'll personally ensure that the flight attendant is spoken to about her behavior. I'll also ensure you're upgraded for the remainder of your journey. Naomi didn't relax. I appreciate the apology, but I need more than that, she said. I need to know that this airline is committed to addressing the systemic issues that lead to behavior like this. If you want to make things right, it's going to take more than a quick fix or an empty apology. The manager nodded, clearly uncomfortable, but finally acknowledged the weight of her words. We'll take your feedback seriously, ma'am. I promise you. Naomi nodded slowly, her expression unchanged. Good, because this is just the beginning. As the manager walked away, Naomi stood there for a moment, collecting herself. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about respect. It was about dignity. And it was about ensuring that change didn't just happen in the boardrooms, but in the everyday moments of life. The passengers around her remained quiet, some exchanging glances, others deep in thought. Naomi knew this wasn't just her personal battle. It was a battle for every person who had ever been made to feel less than, for everyone who had been overlooked or dismissed. As she settled back into her seat, the weight of the situation lingered, but Naomi knew she had made her stand. She had used her voice, her position, and her power to challenge something much bigger than an airline policy. She had made a difference. Naomi stood by the small galley, staring out over the cabin as the flight attendant's departure left behind a lingering air of hesitation. The quiet stir of conversation slowly resumed, but there was a shift in the atmosphere. Naomi's calm but forceful demand for accountability had ignited something within the airline, a quiet but undeniable fire. This moment was bigger than the denial of a seat. It was about every small injustice that had gone unnoticed, unchallenged. It was about the long history of discrimination Naomi had been fighting since the very beginning. In that moment, Naomi knew this incident wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been marginalized, ignored, or brushed aside. She was standing up for the voices that had never been heard, for the countless passengers who had experienced similar mistreatment, without the platform or courage to speak out. Naomi wasn't merely an employee in the system anymore. She had become the voice for those who had been silenced. As the plane landed, Naomi's thoughts were already focused on what came next. She dialed into a video call with her superior, Michael. Naomi, what's going on? Michael's tone was laced with concern, but Naomi could hear the undertones of confusion as well. Naomi didn't waste a moment. I was denied an upgrade by one of our flight attendants, and this wasn't just a mistake, it was deliberate. This is a larger issue with systemic bias that needs addressing. Michael's shock was palpable. For a second there was a pause, then a shift. This can't be a one-off thing, Naomi continued, her voice steady but now filled with a sense of purpose. This is about how we, as a company, interact with customers, particularly those from marginalized communities. This has to be addressed as a systemic problem before it escalates into something bigger. We need a complete overhaul. Michael's face darkened with realization. "You're right," he said, taking a deep breath. "We'll investigate the incident immediately. But Naomi, we need you to lead this change." Naomi didn't hesitate. "I appreciate that, Michael, but this can't just be about an investigation. This has to be the start of something bigger. We need a comprehensive cultural shift. This is about how we hire, how we promote, and how we treat our customers. It's a systemic issue that touches every layer of the organization." As Naomi ended the call, she sat back, thinking about the long road ahead. She had no interest in short-term fixes or band-aid solutions. This was going to require deep, uncomfortable conversations about race, privilege, and power dynamics within the company. She couldn't be part of something that was just about checking boxes. This needed to be the start of real change. Over the next days, the wheels of change began to turn. Naomi's words had resonated deeply within the company. Leadership, HR, and operations teams quickly rallied together to address the issue head-on. The airline issued a public apology, acknowledging the discriminatory behavior, promising to implement changes to address racial bias. But Naomi wasn't satisfied with just words. She wanted action, real, lasting action. Naomi worked closely with HR to design an anti-bias training program that would be rolled out across the airline. But Naomi wasn't interested in a training program that merely raised awareness. She wanted something that would challenge people to confront their own biases and understand how their behavior affected the workplace. "I'm not doing this for lip service," Naomi told HR as they developed the program. "We need empathy-building exercises, real-world examples. We need to make people walk in the shoes of marginalized customers and experience the bias firsthand. It's not enough to just say, 'Don't be racist.' We need to actively dismantle these biases from the inside out." As the months passed, Naomi's leadership was beginning to catch fire. Her approach had always been hands-on, but now it was evolving into something even more powerful, an undeniable force for change. Naomi wasn't just fixing a single incident. She was laying the groundwork for a cultural shift. She wasn't just an employee anymore. She had become the face of an industry-wide movement for fairness and inclusivity. Naomi's work didn't stop there. She turned her attention to the airline's hiring practices, diving into the data with HR to uncover biases that had influenced recruitment, promotions, and pay scales. She worked tirelessly to create more inclusive policies, pushing for diverse leadership teams that reflected the communities the airline served. She knew that true inclusion didn't happen by accident. It had to be intentional. One afternoon, as Naomi reviewed the latest recruitment data, she received a call from one of her HR colleagues. "Naomi, you won't believe the results. The diversity program is bringing in more qualified candidates than we ever thought possible." Naomi smiled. "This isn't about quotas. It's about opportunity," she replied, knowing that the real change was happening when the talent pool itself opened up, when people who had been overlooked for so long were now being given a chance, not because of their connections, but because of their skills and potential. Meanwhile, Naomi's influence spread beyond the walls of the airline. She was invited to speak at industry conferences, sharing her journey and advocating for change in the airline industry. Her keynote speeches resonated with so many others who had faced similar struggles in their own workplaces. At one such conference, Naomi looked out over the sea of faces, many of them leaders of other companies. She had come a long way since her first days at the airline, learning to navigate the complexities of workplace bias and discrimination. But as she took the stage, Naomi realized that her role had evolved into something much greater. She wasn't just speaking about the need for change within her company anymore. She was now challenging the entire industry. Her message was clear. True equality required a fundamental rethinking of how corporate America operated, at every level. Naomi's work had started to ripple through the industry, pushing other corporations to adopt similar measures. What began as a personal fight for justice had grown into a movement that would change the landscape of corporate America for years to come. Even as Naomi's influence grew, she never lost sight of the long-term work ahead. There were still battles to fight. While progress had been made, Naomi knew that change was a continuous process, and her work was just beginning. As the months passed, Naomi continued her advocacy for long-lasting change, becoming a leading voice in industry-wide reform. She worked with other businesses to create effective systems that went beyond tokenism. She helped them create inclusive environments, not because it was the right thing to do, but because it was the smart and necessary thing to do. In the final moments of the script, Naomi stood by the window of her office, looking out at the planes taking off in perfect formation. Her journey had been difficult, filled with obstacles, but as she watched the planes soar, Naomi felt a deep sense of pride. The change she had started wasn't just for her. It was for all the future employees and passengers who would benefit from a more inclusive and fair system. Naomi turned back to her desk, where the work of reshaping the airline continued. She wasn't just an employee anymore. She was the face of change. She was the voice of fairness. Naomi had set the wheels in motion for a revolution in the airline industry, and as the fight for systemic equity continued, Naomi was ready to lead the way, one decision at a time. But over time, Naomi had come to understand something profound. Real change didn't come from isolated victories. It came from the tireless effort to break down systems that weren't designed for everyone to succeed equally. For Naomi, this wasn't just about a job. It was about ensuring that the future would be different for passengers, for employees, and for the entire industry. Looking ahead, Naomi knew this was just the beginning of something much larger, a movement that would ripple across industries, breaking down barriers and ensuring that everyone had the opportunity to rise, not because of who they knew, but because of who they were. Naomi's actions echoed far beyond the walls of the airline. Her confrontation on that flight was no longer just a personal struggle. It had become a rallying cry. As news of her courage spread, what began as an isolated incident evolved into a much larger dialogue about the daily challenges women and minorities face in professional spaces. News outlets picked up the story, and Naomi's name soon became synonymous with the fight against institutionalized bias in the workplace. In interviews, Naomi spoke candidly, emphasizing that her actions on that flight weren't just about a seat. They were a reflection of years of systemic inequalities, some so ingrained they had become invisible to those not directly affected. What began as a confrontation over an upgrade became the catalyst for discussions that rippled across industries. Naomi's story resonated with those who had felt marginalized, overlooked, or misunderstood in their careers. Soon, Naomi was invited to speak at a major leadership conference, an event where top leaders from various industries gathered to discuss the future of the workplace. As she stepped onto the stage, Naomi felt the weight of the room's attention, but there was no fear in her heart. She had risen to this moment through years of struggle, and now she was ready to speak her truth, not just for herself, but for the thousands who had faced the same challenges. She opened her keynote with a simple yet powerful statement. We are not fighting for equality to elevate ourselves alone, but to ensure that no one is ever treated as less than simply because of their race, gender, or background. The room fell silent, every word hanging in the air. Naomi's voice, steady and unwavering, cut through the silence as she addressed the systemic barriers faced by women of color in corporate spaces. She reflected on her own journey, detailing the obstacles she had overcome. From doubting her worth to standing firm against subtle and overt biases. The true measure of leadership, she continued, is not how high you rise, but how many others you bring up with you. The room erupted in applause. For Naomi, this wasn't just a victory, it was the beginning of something far greater. As she stepped down from the stage, Naomi was no longer just a woman fighting for herself. She had become the face of a movement, a beacon of hope, a symbol of the power of individual action to ignite societal change. Her newfound influence allowed her to connect with thought leaders, activists, and organizations focused on equality and diversity. Naomi found herself at the center of a growing network committed to reforming corporate culture. She wasn't merely an executive in a large corporation anymore. She had become a tireless advocate for women, for people of color, and for anyone who had ever been silenced by systemic bias. Naomi's voice was now synonymous with the call for a better, more inclusive future. But Naomi's leadership didn't come without challenges. Within her own company, there were those who resisted the change she was fighting for. Some viewed her efforts as a threat to the established order, while others were uncomfortable with the uncomfortable conversations she was pushing forward. Naomi quickly realized that true leadership wasn't just about making bold speeches. It was about navigating the resistance, managing the discomfort, and pushing forward even when the path was unclear. In one meeting, she faced a senior leader who outright dismissed the need for deep organizational change, arguing that the company's existing diversity efforts were enough. Naomi had to keep her composure, her mind racing as she challenged his assumptions. "What you're calling enough is just the beginning," Naomi replied, her voice measured but firm. "We need to go deeper. We need to address the root of the problem, not just the symptoms. Diversity isn't a checkbox, it's a way of life." It was a turning point. The resistance didn't disappear overnight, but Naomi's conviction began to shift the conversation. People who had once resisted her began to see the merit in her ideas. It wasn't just about equity anymore. It was about the long-term health and success of the company. Naomi had to battle not just external forces, but internal doubts as well. There were moments when she wondered if her efforts were enough. Was she just a cog in a larger machine? Or was she truly making the changes she envisioned? During one late-night meeting, Naomi sat alone at her desk, exhausted but determined. She reflected on everything she had achieved and everything still left to do. She thought about the battles she had fought, from childhood when she'd fought to be seen and heard, to the corporate world, where every step up had been a fight for recognition and respect. This moment of quiet reflection made her realize something profound. True leadership wasn't just about managing change, it was about leading others through it, even when it felt impossible. As the months passed, Naomi saw the fruits of her labor. The airline, once reactive to issues of diversity and inclusion, had begun to make lasting changes. Comprehensive diversity training programs were rolled out for all employees, with a focus on eradicating biases at every level. Naomi's leadership was integral to these changes, ensuring that the company's efforts weren't just performative, but effective. Passenger feedback indicated a dramatic improvement in customer service, with reports of inclusivity and respect becoming more common. Naomi had not only transformed her company, her influence had created a ripple effect, inspiring other companies to adopt similar policies and practices. Her efforts had sparked a movement, one that would leave a lasting imprint on corporate culture. Naomi's journey was far from over. She continued to push for systemic change within her company and beyond. When she was promoted to Chief Diversity Officer, she was now in a position to influence policy and culture at the highest levels. She implemented initiatives to bridge gaps in communication, heighten the recruitment of diverse talent, and increased minority representation at leadership levels. Her leadership was now more than just a role, it was a mission. Naomi's relentless drive for equity had transformed her company's culture, but she knew that this wasn't the end. She continued to push for change, not just for her company, but for the entire industry. Every new initiative, every policy shift, and every conversation was part of her larger vision of a world where diversity and inclusion weren't just goals, but realities. Naomi's influence had transcended the walls of her company. Her leadership had set a new standard for how businesses should view diversity, not as a problem to be solved, but as a critical component of success. She was becoming a trailblazer, not just in the airline industry, but in the larger fight for equity in corporate America. As she stood in front of the mirror one evening, preparing for another conference, Naomi thought about the long road that had led her here. She had fought for fairness, for justice, and for every person who had ever been overlooked. But she knew that her work wasn't finished. The journey toward true equality was ongoing, and Naomi was ready to lead the charge. Her story had started as a single confrontation, a quiet battle in the air. But it had grown into a movement that was reshaping the entire corporate landscape. Naomi Evans had ignited the fire of change, and she wasn't going to stop until every workplace was a place of true inclusion, equity, and opportunity for all. Together, we can make sure that every voice is heard. Thank you for watching, and remember, true leadership starts with action. Stay tuned for more inspiring journeys ahead.